Hello and welcome to Dig School, cross-curricular learning themed around archaeology. Today's workshop is Location, 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 exploring what made the perfect place to live in the past through colonisation and conquest of your own. Key questions we'll be looking at today are: where did people want to live in the past? How do we know? Why does it matter? So the first thing to do, thinking about this, is to look at the reconstruction drawings I'm going to show you, which are all of the same place in the UK at different times. And have a look at them and see carefully what you can see in each picture. Write your answers on page 1 of your workbook. When you've had a really good look at them, start to think about, can you put them into chronological order, that's time order, with the earliest first. So number them on your workbook, with 1 being the oldest picture and 9 the picture of the place most recent in time. Once you've done that, discuss your ideas with others in your group. Have others noticed things you've missed? Do you agree about the chronological order? So here are the pictures, and I'll give you as long as you want to have a look at those. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to have a good look at the pictures, see what you can see in the way of detail, think about what's in them, and think about which came before which are the very oldest, which are the most recent, and which order did those pictures come in. So I'll go through them now. So the earliest one there is picture C, so that should be number 1, which is from the Paleolithic. You might well have got that. You can see there's a mammoth there it's just been hunted. It's being butchered for meat by some people who are not wearing particularly modern looking clothing. And the landscape really has nothing very much in it. It's a very natural landscape. There's no buildings, there's nothing that the people have built at all. The next picture is from the Neolithic, so that's letter H, so that should be number 2. This is a lot more recent in time. The Paleolithic goes on for hundreds of thousands of years and really takes up about 99% of the time that humans have lived in Britain for. The Neolithic is much more recent and is marked by a major change where people started building permanent settlements for the first time. You can see here there's a house, it's got a little pen with some sheep behind it. And it's also a time when people are farming for the first time. That's why you want a permanent settlement. If you've created a field, you need to be there to look after the crops as they grow. You can see the fields in the background. And then right in the very background, beyond the river that's still there, although it's changed its course since the Paleolithic because ice ages in the intervening millennia have eroded away some of the rock that was there previously. But on top of the distant hillsides, you can see on the left-hand side there's a stone monument, a bit like Stonehenge, and on the very right-hand side there's a causewayed enclosure with a small structure which is actually where the dead are being laid out to be put after they're dead. The next picture moves forward in time again. That's the Bronze Age, that's letter F. Here you can see the river's still the same, the distant hillsides are still the same, although the stone monuments deteriorated a little bit. But actually this community have built another wooden circle the other side of the river, and they've even built a bridge to get across the river with. Settlement is in the same sort of place. It's a good spot down by the river. There's fishing, and there's also, of course, the fields in the fertile low-lying ground. The next picture is picture B, the Iron Age. And here you can see the settlement's got bigger. There's a ditch and palisade fence are built around it to defend it. On the distant hilltop on the left-hand side, there's now a hill fort with big earthen ramparts and defences. There's another sort of chieftain's enclosure at the other side of the river, just one house on its own, again with an enclosure around it. And the hillsides, again, still being used for farming. Next one we see is letter E. That's the Roman period, and now on that same spot, still on the river, good for trading connections, good arable land, still vital for supporting the settlement. But now there's a Roman town's been built. We can see it's got stone walls around it and an elegant stone arched gateway going into it right at the front of the page. The other side of the river, we can see there's farmland, and there's actually a Roman villa where that Iron Age chieftain's house was, on that same spot. Up on the top of the hillside where that hill fort was, Roman period, they've now built a Roman temple there, just to prove they've taken it over. And they've now built a bridge, a stone bridge connecting the activity either side of the river, which is itself busy with boats going up and down for trade. Next period is the Anglo-Saxon one, after the Roman period. And you can see there are still the remains of the Roman stone walls and gate, but they've become very tumbled down. They're not being maintained. Central Street is still in the same place, but where that bridge was, that's now collapsed, and it's a ford now, where people are having to wade across. There's still arable fields either side of the river, and there are longships again on the river, though whether they're Anglo-Saxon friendly longships or whether they're Viking invaders, can't really tell. The next picture is the medieval period. Here the settlement's changed again. The central street is still in the same place, and in fact that's still in the same place from the Roman period, that main street. And the Roman gateway has been rebuilt now. The stone walls have been repaired, the gateway is functioning again. And the Motte and Bailey Castle has been built in the centre of the settlement, big artificial earthen mound with grass over it and a timber tower on top of that. The other side of the street to the left, there's a church has been built on the same location where in fact there was a church right back in the Roman period on the edge of the Forum in that Roman city. The stone bridge has been rebuilt in the medieval period, and the arable fields are now laid out in long, narrow strips, giving everyone a fair share of good and bad land. And as before, there are a lot of ships going up and down that river. The next one moving forward in time is the early modern period, that's I. This is sort of period between about 1700 and 1900 AD. Still, we can see the same central street there, the walls of the medieval city and the gateway is still, well, the walls have gone, but the gateway is still there, sort of preserved almost as a sort of status symbol. Where the Motte and Bailey Castle has gone, that's been flattened, but there's now an elegant townhouse or town hall, reflecting that area as being higher status still. Where the medieval church with the tower was, there's now a tower with an elegant steeple. And on the far side of the river, there's a large factory has been built. And just to the left of that, there's an elegant stately home, the residence of that factory owner. And up on the top of the hill, where that hill fort once was, there's now a monument has been built, perhaps to celebrate a famous victory in battle. And then the most recent one is the present day. You probably mostly guessed that one as well. You can see the multi-storey car park. You can see the town hall is still there. There's a park around it now. There's a modern shopping centre replacing some of those Tudor houses that were there previously. The monument is still there on the distant hillside, but on that other side of the river, the town is now growing and expanding up to it, and it probably won't be very long before the settlement expands to have housing estates extending right up to the edge of that hill fort. So now you've got these drawings in chronological order, have a look back through each one and answer the questions on page 2 of your workbook. When you've had a bit of time to do that, compare your answers with others in your class and have a talk about why there are similarities and differences in what you've noticed and what you've seen as signs of continuity and what you've seen as new introductions. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. So now we're going to move on to a very different sort of place. But again, looking at that same question, really, how did people choose where to live? At Chester, the place we've just been looking at in all those reconstruction drawings, which were from a book that I wrote with some colleagues a few years ago, we could see that people kept living in that same space because it fulfilled their needs for agriculture, for opportunities for trade, and because it was a historic place they were already established in. Now, there are lots of reasons why people choose to live somewhere. In pre-modern communities, they need natural resources, and there's a list of them here. There's very basic resources that you need for survival. You need water, you need wild animals, perhaps for hunting for food, you need fertile land for growing crops. You need that fertile land to be light soil that's easy to plough. You need grassland for grazing sheep and cattle, woodland to provide timber for building, fuel for fires, for pottery making and for metalworking, stone for building, for making stone tools, and even for quernstones to grind corn or put into corn mills. You might need clay for making pottery, metal ores for making tools or weapons or jewellery. River or sea, as we saw at Chester, vital for many communities for trade, access to the world, and also, of course, for water. Highland can provide a defensible lookout point or a point on which you can display your status, your monuments, your victory battle symbols. Marshland provides reeds for thatching or wildfowl for hunting and eating. And then, of course, a sheltered location away from the coast is just a little bit better protected from storms and from possible attack than one that's right out on the edge of the sea. And there are then social factors behind why people choose where to live. They might be wanting uninhabited land where there's no one else there that they simply can start a new settlement in. They might be trying to escape a leader who'd been trying to control them and welcome someone somewhere that doesn't have a leader already established. They might appreciate the fact there is a leader there who could protect people. They might be pleased there's land available to rent or to live on in exchange for services to the person who owns that land. They might be interested in a road that allowed easy travel. They might have personal connections with the place. They might have been born there. They might have family nearby. They might not be known nearby. Maybe they're trying to get away from something in their past. There may be amenities nearby, medical help or a religious centre, a town or a market, or sources of entertainment, recreation. It's not all about hard graft. So what I'm going to do now is look at one place and give you a chance to think about how you'd make those decisions on behalf of a group of Vikings wanting to settle on this uninhabited island that you can see laid out here. Where would you, if you were leading that group, choose to build your village? Now, for the sake of making this a little bit more manageable, your Vikings have wrecked this island fairly thoroughly, and they know that the western half of it, the left-hand side, the ground is far too steeply sloping. All those pale brown lines are very close together. They're contour lines. They show it's a very steep slope. They're far too steeply sloping. The only land which is gently enough sloping to be remotely practical to build a settlement on is on the north in that U-shaped bay where the lines are further apart, but a north-facing bay like that is too cold and inhospitable for settlement. So they're focusing just on the eastern half of the island that you can see outlined in a square here. So in your workbook, you've got a close-up of this part of the island on page 3. Now, I'll go through some of the resources here. Some of those are marked on the map. but I'll go through just some of them which might affect your choice of where to put your village for your Viking followers. So, working down the page, top left-hand corner there, rough pasture. Well, that's very useful, provides grazing for sheep, and sheep, of course, provide milk, they provide meat, and they provide wool, which is something you can trade to buy in the items that you can't get from your immediate community. Remember, you're on an island. A hilltop might be a sacred site or a good lookout point. Upland bog provides peat, which is a fuel. A spring could be a sacred site, and streams, in any case, provide fresh water for drinking and cooking and for brewing. Level land that's not too high, not too wet or too stony can grow grain. We use to lay out fields for bread, porridge, and indeed for brewing alcohol. Meadowland near streams provides hay for cattle who give meat and milk, and most importantly, pull the ploughs so that you can cultivate those arable fields. Going on the right-hand side, the sea, of course, provides access to fish and to traders to the outside world. Rocky beaches are home to nutritious shellfish, which you can eat. Loose stones, those little black circles, spreads of loose stone, fantastic source of material for building and for making stone tools. Cliffs house seabirds, which can provide eggs and meat. Hilltop sites, again, good lookout point, good defensible point, possibly a sacred site as well. And then right at the bottom on the left-hand side, the sheltered sandy beaches enable boats for fishing and trade to be safely landed. So, where would you put your village? On your map on page 3 of your workbook, you've got a gridded out version of this map. It's exactly the same map, exactly the same features are there. Your village should cover 5 of those squares. Now they need to be next door to each other, but they can be next door to each other diagonally if you want. They need to be touching each other. Have a careful think about where to put your village that's going to be most advantageous to that Viking community wanting to survive off the land that's available to them and all those resources on that part of the island. Don't let anyone else see what you're doing. We'll find out why a little bit later. So I'll go back to the diagram showing where those resources are and let you start marking onto your map where you're going to put your village. Okay, if you've now had a little bit of time, enough time to mark those 5 squares for your village on your map, what you now need to do is think about what other buildings you want away from the village. So you'll need a little coastal hamlet where boats can be kept an eye on and maintained, and fish that you've caught can be processed. So you need to draw one of those on to take up 2 squares in a place that you think would be good for that. You also need 5 sheilings. These are little seasonally occupied huts really for shepherds when they're too far away from the village to make it practical to come home every day. So they're very small, just 1 square each. Have a think where you'd put those. You also need a fort to protect your land, somewhere where you think is a good defensible site that makes sense to you. It's an important place, so you need 4 squares for that. Again, they all need to be touching each other. Then you need a couple of houses for quarry workers. Stone is a really important resource here. So you've got a couple of houses there, 2 squares each for those. And then a church. People's spiritual well-being is very important to early communities, and the Vikings quickly converted to Christianity. So you'll need a church. It's an important building, so that'll be 3 squares. Think where you're going to put that as well. So again, I'll give you a bit of time to work out where to put all of those different bits of your settlement. Perhaps they're all in the same place, perhaps they're all in different places. It's entirely up to you. Colour in the squares to show which are the ones you've decided to put your settlement in. Okay, so if you've had time to do that, I'll just leave that map there for you. Okay, so if you've had time to do that, what we're now going to do is get you into pairs and do something a bit different. Now imagine you are attacking that community. Maybe you just want to pillage it, maybe you want to take it over. What you need to do is find all those buildings of your partner's community, village and all those other buildings. So do this by keep your map hidden from your partner and take it in turns to call out target squares. Have a guess where you think your partner might have put their village. Call out one square and identify those squares using the numbers along the bottom and up the side of the map there. This is how the Ordnance Survey works out its grid location, so it's a good habit to get into. So as you can see there, just an example, if I wanted to target square 3422, it's 34 squares along and it's 22 squares up. Now I obviously wouldn't do that because it's in the middle of the sea, but I hope it gives you the idea. So take it in turns, just call out one square each, and your partner will then tell you whether it's been a hit, whether it has hit a building, or it's a miss, whether it hasn't hit a building. If you get a hit, you get another go until you get a miss, and then it's your partner's turn. Keep going until one or other of you has eliminated all of your opponent's squares with buildings on them. When you finish this, compare the outcomes of the attack game. Who won? Who lost? Why? What were the faults that made one community vulnerable? What were the strengths that made another less vulnerable? Look at the details as well of who put what bits of their settlement where on each other's maps. Do this through the whole group and then answer the questions on page 4 of your workbook. When you've done that, discuss the answers and have a think about where is the best place for that village. What's the trade-off between security and a convenient, arable location where you are near to your fields and you're near to your livestock? Where do you have to compromise? Where would be the best place? Remember, this is what we saw at Timechester. It stayed in that same place. When you've had a chance to look through all of this, to talk about where you put your settlements, what the priorities are, to have a real discussion about what would you actually do for the best? Where would you go? When you've done that, we'll move on and I'll show you where actually the village was built, because this is a real place. Here's the map that you were looking at, and here's an aerial photograph of that place today. And you can see that the village is actually built in the low-level ground by that sandy bay. Now, the white buildings you can see towards the top of that photograph are modern. They're sort of tourist centres. But the medieval village is strung out around the bay. You can see that ring of little houses that were inhabited right up until the beginning of the 20th century, continuously rebuilt. But the island was certainly occupied in the Viking period, though we don't have any evidence for that yet from archaeology. But you can see how the village was laid out. It's a long linear settlement, a string of homesteads. There's a wall that goes right round the back of them, sort of towards the bottom left-hand side of the picture. That's the limit of the arable land. The walls are to keep sheep and indeed wild animals off those arable fields. You don't want your sheep eating your crops as they're growing. And the little buildings around those walls are little storage huts. that were built around the periphery of the settlement. So you can see that's what the inhabitants of this island, which is called St Kilda, off the west coast of Scotland, that's where they decided to live. How did that compare with your decisions? And that's what that village looks like today on the ground. It's nearly 100 years since the last people left, and one of the final reasons they did leave was actually an epidemic of disease with flu. It only killed 4 people, but that was a substantial proportion of the very small population. What we'll do now finally is just give you a chance to practice your skills in thinking about where to put a settlement for a Viking or early medieval community by looking at another place. I don't know if anyone knows what this island is. Well, it's Iceland, and the location of it you can see here. It's quite big compared to England or Scotland or Ireland or Wales, and you can see it's right off the northwest coast of Europe, coloured in red on the right hand side here. For your interest, the location of St Kilda, that island we were just looking at, you can see it is a very small red dot just off the northwest coast of Scotland. So Iceland is a lot bigger than St Kilda. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you want to have a stop and have a read of this history of the settlement of Iceland by the Norse, another name for the Vikings, then those notes are all up there. The key point I'm going to make is that settlement was first established according to historic sources, and these dates have been confirmed by archaeology, around the 870s. They expanded very rapidly over the 50 years after that, and the most habitable portions of land tended to be the coastline and the inland valleys and some of the low highland sites. By the middle of the 10th century, the sort of 950s or so, the island had been sort of nominally at least divided up into a series of territories, which are defined with the dotted lines here. Though, as you can see in the middle, there are several glaciers, solid sheets of ice where, of course, nobody could live. So those areas are not being intensively used, but they are nominally part of different territories. And we know the Vikings were there. We find buildings from that period all over the island, well, in certain bits of the island. Very characteristic. You can see this aerial shot of an excavated Viking building here with slightly bow sides to it. Sort of, they're known as they're thought to be boat-shaped buildings. And it's been suggested the buildings are actually designed to be the same shape as boats, or perhaps as using the same technology. They're on stone footings, which are all that survives today. The agrarian economy, rather like our settlers at St Kilda, they were sedentary pastoralists, they had livestock, they were living in one place, they did hunting and gathering as well as pastoralism, which is looking after animals, herds of animals, but they hunted and gathered fish and eggs and sea mammals, particularly seals. The settlers brought with them cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, as part of a sort of package that enabled them to survive. Remember how important those cattle and here horses were for being able to pull ploughs, which simply enabled you to cultivate the land. Hay harvested in the summer was essential to keep those livestock alive over winter, and the amount of hay that could be made on the island was one of the limiting factors for arable. Grain that was cultivated was a prestige crop and was used again for brewing alcohol. Again, people like to enjoy themselves and have fun as well as just survive. There's 2 periods at which some of these optimistically founded buildings are abandoned, and there's a couple of explanations for each. So if you want, have a read through of those and discuss which of those 2 explanations of the abandonment of the lowland farms by a very short distance within 100 years of their foundation, again have a look at these possible reasons for a second phase of settlement relocation. This is moving a lot of the settlements away from the upland landscapes, moving to cluster more densely along the coastal plains and along the bays. And again, there are two very different reasons here. So if you want, have a talk and a discussion among yourselves and think about which you think might have been the most likely explanation. Perhaps it was both. And of course, these sites are being excavated, as you've seen, in the attempt to try and find out some of the answers to these questions, the sort of things we're interested in. Why do people live where they do? Why do they move? There's a big cost to moving. It's hard work, and there's no guarantee necessarily that the new site is going to be any better than the old one. Think about those decisions you had to make about your settlement on St Kilda. So just finally, now you've had a lot of time to think about where people lived on these sort of island communities in the Viking and early medieval period. Gives you a chance to think about where were those settlements in Iceland then. There's two maps here you can see, one which shows you land use, the different sorts of land cover, where the pasture is, where the forest is, where all that grey, unusable land is that's covered by glaciers and volcanic deposits. Ignore the red bits on the coloured map there, they're modern stuff which isn't relevant right now. And on the right, to remind you again, is the map showing those sort of territorial divisions, which also shows you where the streams and rivers are on Iceland as well. So have a think about where you think those Viking settlers might have put down their settlements, and mark 50 of them on your map, which is on page 4 of your workbook. When you've had a chance to do that, here are the answers. Did you get any of those sites? How many of the spots you marked are close to those? So give yourselves a pat on the back if you've actually got any close, and a big pat on the back if you've got a lot of the right locations. Just to finish, it's worth thinking that Iceland's unusual because it was settled when there was no one there previously by the Vikings. So they had a completely empty landscape. They could settle as they chose, as they probably found at St Kilda, although it had been settled for a couple of thousand years on and off before. It was probably empty when they first arrived. In much of the rest of the UK, and indeed much of the rest of Europe, we don't have those unoccupied landscapes, and in many cases we don't have as much surviving as there are the remains of those Viking houses on Iceland. But we can find out that many places were inhabited continuously through archaeology and excavation, and even just through field walking. The maps you can see here are just one example of where people have walked across cultivated fields and found potteries of Roman date, of Anglo-Saxon date, and of high medieval date, all in the same sorts of locations, as you can see from the red dots on those 4 different maps that's on the slide now. So finally, we were wanting to look at where did people want to live in the past, and I hope you think you found out a little bit about that. We wanted to know how we know, and I hope you found out a little bit about that. I also wondered, why does it matter? Well, it's interesting. It gives you a chance to practice your skills. It also makes us think a little bit about the history of places around us when we think how much time depth they might have, and how they may have been chosen hundreds or even thousands of years ago by people with very different ideas, perhaps, about what was a good place for them. But actually, that place, in many cases, has continued throughout hundreds of years to still be inhabited. It brings us just a little bit closer to people in the past.